Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about governance in complexity, a webinar co-organized by the European Environment Agency, the European Center for Governance in Complexity, and University of Bergen. The occasion of this webinar is essentially the launch of the report released this morning on governance in complexity, sustainability governance under highly uncertain and complex conditions by the EEA. And I'm very pleased with this publication, which comes, I think, at a timely moment. My name is Laurent Benini. I work for the European Environment Agency in the program dealing with sustainability transitions. Let me say just a few words about the background to this report, which would be possibly insightful for the conversation we're going to have today with the panel. The EEA, the knowledge base that the EEA has been developing over the past 20 years and actually 30 years of its existence has been increasingly moving from the understanding and assessment of the nature of the challenges that we are facing in terms of sustainability, environmental and broader sustainability issues, moving from there into more and more a form of knowledge that helps in responding to these challenges. The concept of actionable knowledge, the idea of sustainability transitions and transformations is our concept that an initiative that the agency has been engaging with for a long time now. And but one thing is reflecting about these issues under very more predictable, say, and uncertain conditions. And a different thing is reflecting about sustainability transition and transformations at the time of major uncertainties and complexities as we are living through. Since our latest publication of the State and Outlook of the European Environment in 2019, which was the 2020 edition, actually, we've been witnessing a number of interconnected crises and shocks. And this creates a very different context in which to engage in relation to sustainability transitions and responses and solutions as well in this context. And in this journey, we're really happy to join our effort with the European Center for Governance in Complexity and the University of Bergen in trying to respond to some of these fundamental questions on how to achieve change, how to navigate these difficult circumstances towards sustainability, and what does it mean. And in particular, I would like to thank the authors of the report, Roger Strand, Zora Kovacic, Thomas Volker, Silvio Funtovic from the European Center for Governance in Complexity, and our EA colleagues, Ana Jesus and Mari Erlandsen, and myself from the EA, who contributed to this development. And as well, a number of key contributors and commentators that have really helped us in reflecting on this long journey, which lasted for probably more than 3 years in crafting these reports. We are very happy today to have 3 or 4 panelists with us who are engaging with around the same questions around these issues of uncertainty and complexity. And let me introduce them before handing over to the presenters and panel debate. So we have Claire Dupont, who is a research professor of European governance and sustainability transformation at Ghent University, who's also chairing the scientific committee of the European Environment Agency. Ruth, welcome, Claire. Ruth Richardson, who's executive director of the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, which is hosted by the United Nations Foundation. Welcome, Ruth. Laurent Bontoux, who's senior Foresight for policy expert at the European Commission Joint Research Center. Welcome, Laurent. And Liselotte Jensen, who's policy analyst at the European Parliamentary Research Service. The panel debate will follow a couple of presentations and will be moderated by Roger Strand. The presentations will be given by Zora Kovacic and Ana Jesus from respectively European Center for Governance and Complexity and EEA, and we'll focus on the highlights of the report, essentially on what it means to navigate this renewed understanding of complexity and uncertainty when dealing with sustainability. So that's it from my side. Very welcome to all of you, and I will hand it over to Anna for her introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Yes, so my name is Anna Jesus. I work at the European Environment Agency with Sustainability and Foresight. And I would like to start this presentation by setting the scene. Next slide, please. So as we hear many times these days, we live in turbulent times that are characterized by multiple interconnected crises. And these crises, they challenge our European and global societies by putting pressure on the life-sustaining systems, on our human health, on our economic prosperity, and also on our social welfare. There's many examples of such crises. I have a few here in the slide. For example, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, the COVID-19 pandemic, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, and multiple unrest and armed conflicts that are happening today. And these crises, they put pressure on our goals for sustainability, but they are at the same time the context in which our work sits, in which we need to move towards achieving EU's long-term vision of living well within the limits of our planet by 2050. And the challenges are immense. The way we have been understanding them and their nature has been evolving. The next slide. So the notion that sustainability challenges are systemic and complex is now widely accepted in policymaking, and the European Green Deal, for example, and all its policies are a reflection of that, but that hasn't always been the case. So our understanding of environmental challenges has evolved from seeing them as specific in the 1970s, where we saw environmental issues as characterized by linear cause-effect relationships, for example, pollution from single-point sources such as factories, to referring to them as diffuse, to recognizing then the systemic and complex nature, as well as their interdependence on broader sustainability issues in past years. And as I mentioned, this has been also accompanied by an evolution in policy and the nature of policy, which now covers all of these dimensions. As a result of this evolving in understanding, a number of conceptual frameworks has emerged to make sense of these challenges. Next slide. And wicked problems and post-normal science are two examples of such conceptual frameworks that we particularly used in this report for the analysis of systemic and complex challenges. And in wicked problems, there's no consensus on how to frame the problem and what counts as a solution. More knowledge about the problem doesn't necessarily translate into knowledge about how to solve it. According to post-normal science, controversies fail to be resolved by appealing to normal science or technical expertise per se, as there's no clear-cut separation between facts and values. Facts actually depend on how the issue is defined and how system boundaries are drawn, which very much depends on the value system, the worldviews of the observer. And finally, the way challenges are understood cannot be seen as independent of how they are managed or governed. So this understanding, this evolving understanding and has of the nature of sustainability challenges, recognizing their systemic and complex nature, also means recognizing the need for new knowledge and for new governance practices to respond to them. And this realization is shared by many experts in the field. Next slide. So when we asked a group of experts in sustainability governance what sustainability governance or the governance of sustainability should look like in the context of complexity and certainty, these were some of the attributes that emerged. So things like humility, openness, participation, interdisciplinary, systems thinking, co-creation, foresight, fairness, and a number of attributes that we don't often associate with sustainability governance. So that being said, I would now like to pass on to Zora, who will introduce the concept of governance in complexity, which is at the center of our report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Yeah, so like Anna said, one of the main ideas of the report is this idea of governance in complexity, which we just opposed to the governance of complexity. So the idea is that under conditions of high uncertainty and when dealing with systemic and complex challenges, we cannot always rely on a model of governance based on prediction and control. So what does governance look like when we are in a situation of limited control? And the idea of the report is to be an invitation to change our mindset when thinking about governance and what governance is, what it should achieve, and what successful governance looks like. And we do this through an exercise of reflexivity. And when we talk about governance, we refer to the double meaning of governing. We can think of governing as navigating. So it entails both a substantive goal of getting to a destination and also the idea of getting there safely. So it has also importantly a procedural aspect to it. So the report, as I mentioned, it invites to an exercise of reflexivity, which includes reflecting and taking also a little bit of a critical look at the problem framings and the models that we use to understand this systemic and complex challenges that we're facing. And one thing that we have noticed and also explained is that there has been definitely an uptake of systemic or systems thinking, but the reflexivity doesn't necessarily also translate into the policy recommendations, the actions, the acting and the governance models that are informed by this systems thinking. So we can think of governance of complexity as, for example, a model that takes up the systemic thinking and may define problems as nonlinear, with feedback loops, path dependency, lock-ins, rebound effects, etc. And all this better knowledge of the challenges that we are facing may be translated into looking for a solution, how to tame this complexity. And it may invite a very assertive type of governance. And the idea of governance in complexity is to be a little bit more adaptive. So what does it mean to deal with non-linear and complex systems? It may mean, on one hand, that we are also dealing with uncertainty, unpredictability, indeterminacy, and so we don't have always perfect knowledge of the challenges that we're dealing with. And when acting upon these challenges, we may not have perfect control either. So this is the general idea of how we went about reflecting and thinking about both the problems and the responses. And then in terms of practices, when we talk about governance and complexity, what are we talking about? And we didn't want to provide in the report a blueprint, a sort of 1, 2, 3 steps of this is how you do governance in complexity. And so what we did was to turn to a set of principles as a way of being reflexive about governance practices. So in just opposition to the idea of control, we talk about experimentation. So we may not always know exactly the results of our actions or what the outcome will be. So any governance intervention under these conditions can be thought of as an experiment. And how should this experiment be carried out? The idea is, of course, not to treat society as a guinea pig, but rather to be inclusive and responsible and fair and transparent, etc., towards society. And so two important principles are also participation and care. So the idea is that this experimentation should be a collective experimentation, a participatory one. So when we talk about, for example, systems thinking, this should also be a collective practice that may include precaution and anticipation. And this is the general idea of how we may describe something that looks like governance in complexity. What we do also in the report is to look at 4 examples of crises, of this multiple and interconnected crises that we've been experiencing. Some are long-term crises like biodiversity loss, and we can call it a crisis of our consumption and production patterns, which are unsustainable and have sparked debates about the need to go beyond GDP and beyond growth. And then we have 2 cases which are more shock, like short-term crisis, like the energy crisis sparked by the invasion of Ukraine and the COVID pandemic. And we take these 4 examples and see what the governance responses have been in these cases. And we see both elements of governance of complexity and of governance in complexity. So a quick example of the governance of complexity may be that a recurrent feature is that some of these crises are, at least rhetorically or discursively, turned into or spoken about as opportunities. So the energy crisis is framed as an opportunity to accelerate the transition towards renewable energies, or the need to recover after the pandemic was framed in Europe as an opportunity to build back better and to implement some of the goals of the European Green Deal, which was published just before the pandemic and put on pause, so to speak, because of the emergency. And so this solutionist way of looking at this crisis is part more of the governance of complexity framework, but we see that a lot of the principles that we identified are also present in all 4 case studies. Definitely experimentation, system thinking, in some cases some precaution. And so part of the exercise that we do is to highlight these practices, which tend to be mostly marginal practices. They are not necessarily the main response to this crisis, but they are there. And so we think it's interesting to see that when we talk about governance in complexity, we're not talking about something esoteric or yet to be implemented. It's just not the dominant practice, but it may be interesting to take a look and take these practices seriously and see what they can do for sustainability. And one principle that we see that definitely could be strengthened a lot across all 4 examples that we use is participation. And so to wrap this up, I just wanted to read the conclusions of our report, some of the main take-home messages. And the first is that systemic and complex challenges may not have perfect solutions or fixes. And in such situations, a more realistic option is to work toward resolve, and we talk about resolve rather than solutions. And we suggest doing this by broadening the knowledge base and gathering concerned parties to collectively find a practical way forward. So resolving implies a need to abandon false hopes of perfect solutions and win-win strategies, aiming instead for overlapping consensus and preparing for inevitable compromises and painful trade-offs. So we also say that progress towards sustainability appears unlikely unless sustainability advocates find ways of constructively engaging with those who resist. There must be a mindset of experimentation, trial, and the removal of error.
Thank you, Zora. And my name is Roger Strand, and it's my honor and pleasure today to moderate the discussion that we'll now have on the basis of the report that has been mentioned and the presentations. First of all, before we return to the panel, I am just going to put in the webinar chat the link to the actual publication for those who haven't seen that already. So it's there. I also would like to mention that we will now have a half an hour where the panel gets to discuss, gets to present their view. But while this is happening, you who are among the audience, the attendees, since this is a webinar, unfortunately we cannot open the microphone and camera for attendees, but we really hope that you would like to write your questions and comments in the Q&A. And then we will keep an eye on this and moderate and try to bring up as many of your questions and comments into the panel in the course of the seminar. So you will find at the lower half of your Zoom window, I'm sure, a button with a question mark which says Q&A, and you can write there. Okay, so we have already been introduced with our wonderful expert panel today with Claire Dupont, Ruth Richardson, Laurent Bontoux, and Liselotte Jensen, and I'm not going to reintroduce them and their credentials. In the preparation for this webinar, we, of course, we want to hear your views, yeah? But we also presented a couple of possible guiding questions that the panelists may or may not choose to take up if they so wish. But also for the audience, it could be nice to think about these following 3 questions. What can this report do for you? The second one is, what new ideas did you get from it? And if you haven't read it so far, of course, it may be that those in the audience would not be able to answer that question until tomorrow or later tonight. And thirdly, who should read it and why should they do so? Without further ado, I will simply let the panelists in turn have their introductory statements before we get a little bit of discussion between them and then move to the Q&A phase. And the order will be as mentioned. So the first one out is Claire Dupont. So the floor is yours, Claire.
Thank you very much. And thank you both also Lorenzo, Anna and Zora, all 3 of you, for the introduction remarks and the presentation. I've really enjoyed reading this report, and I'm happy to have the chance to answer some of those questions and maybe give a few other reflections on it. I was first thinking about this idea of turbulent times, because from a research perspective, we've been discussing this notion that we are living in turbulent times for quite some time, especially in the European context. And I think it's interesting to think about sustainability as part of that turbulence, or as embedded in that turbulence, because we now think in a research context that this turbulence is the new normal. So it's really nice to see in this report that you take that as a starting point. We're in these turbulent times, and let's think about what that means for governance. So the question about what can this report do for me? As a research professor of governance, it really struck me when I was reading the report how, as a community of researchers, we have a whole range of concepts and ideas and frameworks and terms for what we see occurring in terms of the challenges to governance, the challenges of governing, and the very complex nature of society as a whole at the moment. And it made me reflect quite a lot on the evolution of the field of research on governance. And I wonder if this report could be a springboard for maybe thinking more about what are the most useful ideas that we have in this current context that we can bring forward in research. And your 6 principles that you outlined in this report, I think, can be a really interesting avenue for further exploration. I would really recommend to everybody who's working in the research area to think about testing these principles and examining them in other contexts. I also think about it in terms of a multi-level governance context, whereas this report really focused at the European level. What does it mean for cities? How can these principles be applied there, or have they been, or could they be, or should they be? At the national level, at regional level, even in a transboundary level inside and outside the EU. There's much more, I think, that can be done to really reflect on the application, the usefulness, and even the good practice behind these principles. So that already gave me a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate that. The other thing that struck me with this report in terms of what it brought to me and what new ideas I got for it was this governance in complexity notion, as opposed to governance of complexity. And just to add to a little bit further, it strikes me that governing in complexity means complex governance, in that we have to have a complex governance system to deal with governing in complexity. And this is a really interesting thing to think about from a different point of governance, and that is notably the democratic governance context. So in your principles in the report, there are some democratic governance principles coming to the fore. And this is really also thinking on the how of the transformative governance that you're talking there. But one of the things, and also Zora mentioned it in her presentation, was this idea of changing our mindset. But the question there is, whose mindset needs to be changed? Because in a democratic context, it's the citizens, the people, who are supposed to have control over governance. I think this brings us back to thinking very much about democratic governance as a whole. And we have some really interesting research on the inherent weaknesses of our democratic systems that are perhaps further shown or further highlighted because of the complex sustainability challenges that we find ourselves in. And there are two that really stand out. And one is the fact that we have episodic participation. So the participation is seen in an ordinary, normal governing times, not this turbulent times, as being fairly weak as a point of governance in democracies. And the second, say, weak point of democracy is that we have bureaucracies who run the day-to-day affairs. And if these bureaucracies are not accountable and transparent, that raises further questions about whether or not the people really feel like they are the ones who are governing. And I think the last few years, we've seen how these two inherent weaknesses in our democratic systems are really challenged and really coming to the fore when we think about the climate, the environment, and the sustainability challenges. Because, for example, it's very easy to talk about in this governance in complexity context that we don't necessarily have control over everything. But when an electorate sees that, does that mean that they seek further changes in the governing structures and in those who are making the decisions? Because what the people want, what the electors want, is an opportunity to have control over governance. So I think there's still some tension there that we need to figure out when we think about democratic governance, the inherent weaknesses that are anyway in there that are further under strain from the sustainability challenge. How a governance in complexity view can really help us overcome those inherent weaknesses or inherent weak points of our democratic system. And participation does have a strong role to play here, but I think there's probably more that we need to unpack, and I'm looking forward to seeing more research on this. The last question that you raised was who should read it and why. I think everybody should probably read it. But I think this report is particularly of interest to governors, because they need to be the ones who are reflecting on how they are approaching their governance process. And I think for me, the how question of this report is particularly interesting because it implies quite a lot of changes from how procedures occur normally. But I think we need to have governors reading it. And I really think we need to think about the report being applicable to governors at multiple levels of governance. And then I also think we need the research community to engage with this report, because this report does raise new concepts and ideas that aren't necessarily mainstream in the governance research community. And it would be interesting to have a wider research engagement with these ideas also to be able to test them further, to be able to assess the usefulness in the current context that we're in. So I would really recommend, and I'm going to be recommending it to my colleagues to read. And I'd just like to finish there with those thoughts and say also congratulations on the report.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you for a very rich comment. And I guess we're all having a lot of ideas already, and more there will be, because we will pass on to the next member of the panel. And so I will invite Ruth Richardson for an opening comment.
Thank you so much, Roger, and thanks for the invitation to comment on this. I'd like to first touch on what struck me in this report, and I was hard-pressed to keep my list short, since there's so much that is critical to consider, so congratulations to all. Let me name just 3 things that struck me. First is the emphasis on values and principles. It's mentioned in the report that, quote, following the principles of the EU White Paper on Governance, the quality of governance lies in the principles it adheres to. The quality of governance lies in the principles. This should not be understated. Principles surround us. We find them in the UN Charter, in economics and human rights, but they remain on the fringes of public debate, action, and explicit guidance in how to address the crisis we face, from climate change to biodiversity decline to geopolitical unrest. And this paper brings principles to the fore, I believe, in a very explicit, practical, and powerful way. The second thing that struck me is the conceptualization and the balancing of the yin-yang, of the assertive yang posture and the adaptive, intuitive, receptive yin posture. You articulate the need for both and the need to embrace both, from a solutionist approach built on agency strength and instrumental rationality, balanced with an approach which emphasizes radical change, deep transformation, institutional change, public participation, and new social practices. This is very much in line with ASRA's theory of transformation, as we call it, which is inclusive of multiple theories of change. And I very much appreciate you articulating the dichotomy and holding the tension between both. Third, and really importantly, is the question of agency. The Lloyd's World Risk Poll published last week tells us that there has been a global increase from 36% to 43% in the number of people who say that they can do nothing to protect themselves and their families in a disaster. This suggests a global loss of agency. I read a book last week by Karen O'Brien that talks about the paradox of mattering. In this book, she says, quote, most people recognize that humans matter when it comes to transforming the global environment. However, many of us feel that we do not matter when it comes to deliberately transforming ourselves, our societies, and our systems to meet the challenges that we are facing today. This is very interesting. We believe we matter in causing the trouble, but we don't matter in finding the solutions. This is a paradox indeed. So this is why your emphasis on agency is so important. And as your report strongly urges, as risks mount, the necessity to connect with and empower citizens to act has never been more critical. This brings me to who I think needs to read this paper. It is, of course, about governance, and governance has many forms. However, the paper mentions needing to tackle the underlying political, social, and environmental challenges we face. And I would underline political, especially in light of your research that notes that none of the selected cases for this report showed strong elements of participation as a part of governance in complexity. Of course, participation goes beyond political participation, but political participation is such a critical component of agency in terms of democratic engagement that it therefore makes political decision makers a particularly ripe audience. I would point to policy and decision makers in national government and regional agencies involved in regulating and planning and leading in emergencies and crises, as well as the people that support them, including technical experts and practitioners from specialisms such as infrastructure planning, climate change, public health, and so on. Maybe this points to the bureaucracies that Claire's just spoken to. Of course, I hope it gets read far and wide beyond political circles. However, politics are central to how we govern in crises. Finally, you asked, what can this report do for you? Well, simply put, there are so many synergies with ASRA's work. This report deepens and supports our thinking and emergent positions on systemic risk assessment and response. And I really see this paper, this report, as kind of part of the global drumbeat on the need for systems approaches, the importance of values and principles, the imperative for participatory approaches, experimentation and learning, the necessity to embrace trade-offs and compromise, with narratives around kind of optimal solutions or fixes and win-wins being far too narrow, the necessity of transdisciplinary models and more open processes of knowledge production, and the elevation of transformation and deep radical change. Could this report, this body of knowledge and perspective, be part of the tipping points in social norms you talk about, which are nonlinear and unpredictable? What if we hit a tipping point of these new ways of thinking, of acting, of being? What if the recommendations in this report took hold and became the norm? What if? This is an amazing contribution to that possibility. And I look forward to working with you all to, quote, stay in the trouble, as your report suggests, as well as stay with all the amazing signs of positive change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I would also like to mention for the audience, for those who are not familiar yet with ASRA's work, that is the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment. This is something you might want to check out when the webinar is done, and Google it, and you will find lots of interesting things. Without further ado, we will continue with our panel comments. So I will give the floor to Laurent Bontoux for the third comment.
Thank you very much, Roger. First of all, I'm very humbled by the first two interventions, in this panel. I think they've said already quite a lot. So I want to thank you all very much also for having invited me here today to share some of my very personal views about this report. People have been talking about complexity for quite a long time. And in the 1990s, we even started to talk about the emergence of a new academic field, which is complexity science. I remember Professor Melanie Mitchell from the Santa Fe Institute, who wrote a couple of very nice books about complexity to really introduce this notion to the wider audience. Then we had the kind of thing framework, developed by Dave Snowden. That's also very well known. But what I was missing from all these early work was the nice and well and system is. We understand that there is emergence, there are tipping points, but of course we also start to understand that complex systems are inherently unpredictable, and all this makes it very troubling for policymaking. Because the point of policymaking is to really build a known desirable future, which calls on policymakers to have a good grasp of the impacts that their actions will have. This report, that for the first time, in my knowledge, I find a report which I find concretely pragmatic to help me in my foresight practice in a policymaking body. I think this is really addressing quite a challenge. And I think that's where this work on governance in complexity becomes fundamentally important. And I think it should really be compulsory reading to any policymaker. But I think it really should be disseminated far and wide among all the people who are involved in governance in one way or another. I think it's really an important piece of work that should be shared with people who are called as scientific experts, for example, to give advice, in policymaking. So I work in the field of foresight, foresight for policy, and I know that the future is unpredictable. And I know that before needing methods and approaches to make sense of the future, we need a general change in the mindset of policymakers to make people more comfortable with uncertainty. You know, this is something that I face every day. The policymakers are in a very normative world. You know, they want solutions and they hate uncertainty. You know, they work a lot with forecasts. But I really think that it's very important for them to understand how open complex systems are, you know, and actually live with this uncertainty, learn to appreciate that uncertainty also means openness, possibility to see opportunities where you don't normally see one. And I really think that being able to explore and consider the space of possibilities before applying the normative thinking that the development of policies requires is really, really important. The scale of the complexity we're facing is really enormous. And so this report makes this very important point that the multiple frames can be used and are used to define whatever the problems are or the challenges are. And that the complexity that we're facing is beyond the capacity that any single expert to solve. You know, this emphasis on the collective and the collective intelligence is really important. So the 6 practical principles to move forward, I find very much in line with what we practice and we preach, you know, in the work of Foresight, like experimentation, you know, systems thinking, participation. I think participation is very often underestimated. I mean, it's not only participation, but it's properly engaging with people to generate collective intelligence. And the precaution, anticipation, and care, of course, you know, are quite obvious to me. I really very much like these principles because they overlap to a large extent with what we do in Foresight for Policy. And we've also worked a few years ago to develop a sort of handbook for what we call co-creation for policy, that also developed some principles that overlap with what this report says. Putting these 6 principles in practice also requires a structured approach, calling on many diverse kinds of knowledge and strong collective intelligence to be able to implement evidence-informed policy making. We've been talking a lot about evidence-informed policy making, and a lot of people assume that evidence is just a bunch of data coming from some scientific experiment. But actually, here what this report shows is that there's a lot more meaningful evidence that has to be brought to the fore in policy making that goes well beyond just data. This collective intelligence through participation that this report calls for, I think, is really essential. So the main learning I derived from this report, and the main practical learning on my side, is that in today's very complex world, in which very few people actually agree on what the problem actually is, you know, as the problem really cannot be defined, the best approach is to engage in an inclusive collective exercise to agree on what to do next, rather than trying to find the solution. Okay, and if we manage to do that well, what I see as a side benefit of this is something that would address a frustration that we very often have, you know, all of us working in the Commission trying to push towards the systemic transformation towards sustainability, is the coherence across policies. Very often, you know, silo A does something and silo B does something else, and they each feel that it's the right thing to do. But very often this coherence is missing because there is not this collective approach, this participatory approach, which helps people together actually understand what the collective next step should be, you know, what it is to move in the right direction beyond just trying to solve, you know, one problem of mobility or one problem in agriculture or one problem in whatever policy field there is. You know, I think that the report here provides a very interesting framework, which is quite pragmatic and applied, that moves beyond, you know, the understanding of complexity that people used to have. Here, you manage to add an extra layer that makes sense of this and transforms the concepts into something which is practically applicable. So I agree completely with what Claire Dupont was saying earlier, but my perspective is, you know, bottom up, you know, on the ground, trying to actually make this happen and improve the policy making on a daily basis beyond just the research in academic circles. And I really think that this report is going to be very successful, both in feeding the further thinking in academic research, but also the application of some of these fundamental principles in actually helping us make policymaking better suited to the sustainability transition. So thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Laurent, for these words from your position within the European Commission, and for reminding us that evidence is much more than data and also a matter of collective intelligence. So we are moving to the first introductory statement in the panel, and now we move from, as it were, from the European Commission to the European Parliament. So I welcome you, Liselotte Jensen, to share your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Roger. I hope you can hear me okay.
Absolutely.
Good. Thank you so much also for the report. It was an interesting read. It gave a lot of food for thought. And thank you for my co-panelists' comments here, which gave even more food for thought on how this report can be used and also how to think about it in other ways. And I think this is exactly one of the main points made in the report, that it depends, it's individual how we see, how we read things and how we perceive issues, and therefore also the solutions. And when it comes to the complex issues that we're facing today, there will not be a perfect fit that everybody can agree on, and there will not be a perfect fit because we don't know what we need to know. So what the report can do for me, I think that I actually I found comfort in the report. Of course, I've worked a lot on some of these theories and frameworks in my work on climate action, and especially the transition theories. And one can say that it can be immensely frustrating to look at facts and not see solutions move in the right directions. And I think that we are having a lot of climate anxiety, in particular in the younger generation. And I think that this is a sign of that there is an acknowledgement of an overarching issue, and not a perception that things are moving fast enough. And I think that reading this report actually can build some mental resilience, that this is normal because the issues are so complex and there are too many considerations to be made, and a lot of perspectives to be included, and we cannot it is not issues where it's possible to make fast decision. It is trial and error, as mentioned, and I think that it was comforting for me in the retrospective after reading it, that okay, this is normal, and we will find a way, and that we need to read this and then take the point of, we need to be constructive, we need to engage, we need to ensure participation of all levels, we need to act with care, and in order to find solutions that are the best that can be achieved at the certain times, with the acceptable trade-offs that they may have. And that in a way is comforting, that it gives you some steps of how to determine what kind of a problem you're dealing with, and then with that knowledge try to be more reflexive on moving towards the best possible solutions that can be achieved. In the European Parliament, we have tried to make a slight reform, and this is one of the things that I was considering in terms of what new ideas, that this restructuring of political committees actually came from an acknowledgement within the European Parliament that we don't have, it is very siloed in the committees, the political areas, and there is too many overlapping issues where we have conflicts of competence because it goes in several committees. And this has been worked on for the last year to restructure the committees to have less of this overlapping these conflicts of their mandates in terms of issues. And I came to the idea that actually it is very good that this work is ongoing to try to keep on adapting to the circumstances that we find ourselves in, but that itself is also an ongoing process, because even for that, if we don't know the extent of all the issues that are interconnected with the complexity of our challenges, then it is also not possible for us to actually find a perfect structure in our committees, because it will always be too complex to be encompassed. Now, who should read it and why? So Claire mentioned governors, and then Ruth afterwards mentioned this loss of agency towards solutions. And I took note that Claire also mentioned this episodic participation of citizens. And with those combined comments, I actually, I think that there's a lot of different entities and individuals who could have great use of reading this for a better understanding and some guidance for moving forward. But I think that we should actually try to work on putting some of this material also in education for the younger generations, to build agency, to have an understanding of governance happening as a multi-level participatory process, and that everybody is supposed to participate in order to find solutions that will work also in the future. Because right now we have a system where many may feel quite removed from the decisions that are being taken. So actually to try to boost the feeling of agency among ordinary citizens, I think this report could actually help in that work as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we could have a full day seminar around each of these comments, I believe. We also have some questions already in the Q&A. I would like to remind everybody of the possibility of writing more questions there, and we will return to them shortly. I just wanted to ask a couple of things to the panel first, really, and it's open if anybody wants to comment. So just to share one inside fact, perhaps, about the making of these reports. I think already Bismarck said something about the production of public texts in the 19th century. But I guess we discarded at least 250 pages from what finally became 100 published pages. This is, of course, normal to try out things and revise and discard and try anew, etc. For instance, we ended up with a list of 6 principles that somehow crystallized the mindset of governance and complexity to us. I think at one point we had 15 principles, most of which nobody understood except ourselves. I would just like to ask the following open question to you, and then whoever grabs the opportunity is welcome to say something. First of all, do you find anything lacking in this report, either its principles or its other matters? Some have already commented on this. The other question is, did you find any of the content provocative or too radical, as it were? So Claire, you are first to go.
Thanks so much for those questions as well. I think finding things lacking is a bit of a tricky question, because of course there's a lot that could be added, but what needs to be added is maybe something else. And I'm not sure there's anything that stands out as lacking right now. But I do feel like the multi-level aspect of this complexity could have been further reflected upon, because also the European Union is itself, and the European continent, you know, it functions in a multi-level context. And I also was thinking afterwards about, you know, are there some principles that are just so foundational that they are more important than others? And I wonder, do we need to have some reflection on that? Is it in the context of sustainability, we often question whether the outcome or the process is more important. And when we think about sustainability and our planetary life support systems, clearly we need to get a good outcome. But if we do that in a way that alienates people or that creates further problems, is that outcome still the outcome that we want? And are there other principles that need to be reflected upon? And I think that conversation is only touched upon here. And I think it's a really good start. And perhaps that's for another process where we start going further and thinking about these questions of hierarchy. And in some ways, this is a new social contract that needs to be drawn up about what are the principles that we as a society want to adhere to most predominantly, and how do we get to those principles within the context of complexity that we're functioning in. And in terms of provocative content, I think probably it may be more provocative from a practitioner point of view than a research point of view. So I might not answer that question myself. But yeah, I still think that it's hard to talk about what's missing because there's already so much there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Laurent, you were second up with the hand.
Yes. Thank you. No, I just want to completely agree with Claire. I think the point is not so much trying to look at what is missing. I think if we manage to actually implement what's in this report, already this will have been a huge achievement before trying to find anything that might be missing. And then to rebound on another point that I saw on one of the slides at the beginning of the presentation, I want to say something about humility. I think what this report can do, how can I say that? Maybe I can rephrase that. Okay. Politicians in particular, they want to show certainty. They want to tell people, you see, I've identified the problem and I can bring you the solution. And we see lots of parties right now in electoral campaigns here and there telling people, we have the solution, okay? And we know the fallacy of that thing, you know, I mean, we know that this is not true. But here in this report, I find a rationale for high-level politicians or high-level policymakers to justify why they can afford to be humble. You know, instead of feeling forced to be able to tell people, even when they don't know, you know, that they have the solution, that they will find the way, and that they will do the right thing. Actually being able to recognize that we live in a hyper-complex world and bring all these principles to the fore, that can justify actually developing a process, and that's where I want to rebound on what Claire was saying, you know, create a process which is inclusive, which is going to be optimally used to generate a positive outcome to actually help us move in the right direction. And that's where I would not make actually such a dichotomy or a difference between the process and the outcome. I think the two of them are intrinsically linked. I'm an engineer by training. I don't know, and I know that you cannot get the outcome you want without having the necessary process before. So this report helps us actually understand process in a broader, you know, more robust way, which I find similar to what we do in Foresight, what we preach in Foresight. And I think that having more people say similar things coming from different angles from academia, you know, and being able to then implement this type of approaches, you know, in practice, I think can only help us become better and deliver better outcomes thanks to processes which are better thought through, are more participatory, are more inclusive, and actually generate evidence for policy beyond what people consider classically as valid evidence.
Thank you. I think some of us also at least believed we observed during the pandemic that in those countries where both political leaders and experts said, we are not sure now actually, but that actually perhaps they sometimes saw that the general population reacted very positively to that kind of openness and humility. Ruth, you also wanted to add something now.
Yes, thank you, Roger. I can't not jump in when the discussion is about principles. I could talk about principles all day. And as mentioned, ASRA is founded on a set of principles. We may have fallen into the trap of having too many, but we have 10 principles with an overarching principle, and we decided to maintain that number just because we felt each was so important and distinct. And I think this question of kind of the outcome principles versus process principles is an interesting one, without getting into a false dichotomy, because I agree with Laurent that they are very, very much interconnected. We have both. So we talk about justice, and we talk about non-human sanctity. We talk about universal responsibility. That one you could argue is sort of an outcome and a process, but nevertheless, it's sort of all in there. I think with the principles that you've identified, to my way of thinking, they just provide an incredible platform upon which to kind of hold discussion and debate, and they can live and evolve. The other thing is, to Claire's point, you know, I'm from Canada, so I don't understand the European system entirely, but are there sort of these outcome principles or higher level kind of overarching principles that already exist kind of within the European system? You look at, for instance, the UN Charter of Human Rights, or, you know, there are a number of principles, the Earth Charter, that you can kind of adhere the process principles to create a more comprehensive set. But anyway, regardless of whether one would go down that road or not, main point being just, I think it's incredible, as I said in my opening comments, that you've actually put principles so explicitly in the center of this report. And I really do feel like they provide the basis for incredible discussion and kind of experimentation and learning.
Thank you. I would like to move to, we have now a great deal of great questions in the Q&A. And some of them may even be such that Anna or Lorenzo or Zora might want to stay on the alert, because you might have some contributions there. But there was one that was directly directed to you, Ruth, where it says, can you please share the link to the survey showing loss of agency you referred to?
Yes, Roger, I apologize, but I clicked the wrong box and now I can't go back. So if that person could just resubmit the question, then I can put in the link. It's too long to say it loud. But if you could just reinsert that question, I'll just write in the link. Great.
And possibly also it may be possible to put in the chat for you, our panelist. I'm not sure about that though. And then there is a question that is, how are we going to answer it? It's really important, and it will demand the most of us to be able to answer it. So the question is, how do we make all of this, all of what we are discussing, sexy and fun, between inverted commas, when other people present simple solutions to wicked problems that might feel more inspiring or speaks more to short-term reward? I mean, I'm also involved at my University of Bergen in a graduate program on sustainability, master program on sustainability, and we teach the student this kind of stuff that we're discussing now. And there was sort of, what is our selling slogan? One of my colleagues said, our slogan is, we see problems where others see solutions. And this is difficult to sell, of course. Liselotte.
Hi. Well, I thought I would try to jump in on that, and also with a follow-up to what Laurent was just discussing about humility among politicians. I think it can be summed up as I think Laurent also mentioned, we have a lot of these, especially in electoral campaigns, as we just saw, very, very precise, short messages about how a party or an individual has a plan that will solve everything. And it's usually simple, because otherwise it doesn't work on X or Twitter or wherever you want to post it. So it has to be quite simple. And I think that I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is going to make our discussion sexy and fun, but it might just add some nuance to the messaging of these simple solutions, because there are no such thing as simple solutions. That is why this report is very welcome, because it actually explains it very well. All the things that we need to consider and how it can be difficult to get to any solutions that are encompassing enough and will work for us as well as the environment within which we live. So I think it's more about actually adding content to those other solutions and adding perspectives on then how does, I mean, engaging, because it is about the participation. So engaging in, so how does that work with this perspective? I mean, have you considered this? Like adding actually the content into those messages, because generally in simplistic messages, you are presenting a solution to one issue and you're ignoring 20. So you need to make sure that you actually bring the spotlight on the other 20, because that will actually open up the debate. Hopefully a fun and sexy debate, but I'm not sure. But at least it will open up a space for comments on the values that everybody who has perhaps heard this simple plan and they thought this was a great idea, how do they feel about the other 20 perspectives and how they are going to be considered? And by doing that, we can actually start actually this governance and complexity where we are engaging wider and making sure that we take into considerations the things that were ignored or maybe not even considered.
Thank you. Laurent, you also wanted to add something there.
Yes, very quickly. The sexy and fun, I had to react on this. I think this is possible. I believe it is also necessary. But in order for this to happen, you have to create safe psychological spaces. And this is something that we do a lot in Foresight, when we do Foresight exercises. What we do is that we project people, let's say 20, 30 years into the future, so into a time that does not exist. So then people feel psychologically at ease. And then we can make them actually discuss these very difficult topics in a systemic perspective, and then, it's like, and we use serious games to do this, and people can have fun discussing really serious topics, thanks to these kind of tricks, that help people engage, as long as this is in a safe psychological space. And I'm going to leave the floor to Claire, because Claire has actually practiced this in her classes, using our tool called the Scenario Exploration System, which is designed exactly for this, to get people out, to be able to help them have a structured conversation on very serious topics that can be fun, because people feel that there's no risk, trying out the craziest ideas, and so, yes, I would encourage people to engage in these kind of things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Claire, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. I have a couple of ideas on this. So one is really, why does it need to be sexy is one of my first questions. I think what we need to have is more honesty. And I think this is where the humility discussion came in, what Laurent and Liselotte were talking about in terms of humility. I think it's important, but that's also about honesty. And I think what we're currently seeing is this symptom, or maybe it's the consequences of a lack of honesty from our political classes. And I don't know if that lack of honesty is because they simply were not sufficiently educated or aware. I feel like from a research perspective, we've been talking about these problems for a long time. So I don't know if I can accept that as an excuse as a non-policymaker, but as someone who is more on the research side, it seems that there has been an insufficiently honest conversation or honest expose of the reality of the sustainability challenge that we're in. and that has led to space for these also dishonest, easy solutions to come to the fore, which then capture the imagination, because nothing else has captured the imagination, because we haven't done enough of this visioning process to how the world could look like, what it could look like if we were to, as fully participative agents in this change, move towards a more inspiring vision of a better world in the future that is sustainable. So I see there's been insufficient understanding of the need to build this vision, insufficient understanding of the importance of honesty, and we're kind of having to pick up a few of those pieces as a result. And certainly I see the latest election campaigns as almost the consequence of that previous insufficient action and dishonesty.
Thank you very much. And I was reminded of Ruth's opening line that the quality of governance lies in the principles it adheres to. While I have you here, Claire, there is also, and it's you can decide whether it's related, whether this question is related to the, let's say, the topic of the quality of the public sphere. So there is a question. I'm going to read it. Claire, what is your view on the influence of large companies on public policies? Could that be a third weakness of our democracies?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because the influence of companies is not, it's not an inherent built-in weakness of our system. It's more because we have these other weaknesses, the episodic participation and the fact that there are these bureaucracies that are built in to manage day-to-day affairs, which is, you know, necessary. So the result of this episodic participation and the bureaucracies is that people feel less and less like, or the perception that they are less in control or less the governing actors. And so I think because we don't deal, or let's just put it like this, when the times are good for democracy, we don't pay attention to the inherent weaknesses in it. When the times are bad for democracy, all of a sudden there are all these problems that are clearly evident before us, but those are anyway built into the system, those weaknesses. And the fact that there are large companies who are able to influence policy making, they have access to policymakers far more than citizens, is more because we have this episodic participation than the fact that companies themselves are given an extra step up. So they take advantage of the weaknesses as opposed to it being a weakness inherent in the system itself. I think, though, we've started to wake up to the fact that we cannot just assume that democracy can take care of itself. And so there is a bit more attention paid now, perhaps a little bit late, but it is starting to become more of a key aspect, paying attention to the weaknesses in our democratic system to be able to bolster the structures of democracy, strengthen it in general. And that if that happens, then in theory, companies should lose that over influence, and that other actors should have also, you know, the opportunity to participate and influence decisions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Liselotte, did I see a hand or
Well, it was Claire mentioned everything that I actually just thought to say, but that is exactly, I just wanted to agree that exactly the weakness is not necessarily the big companies. The weakness is that we don't have the agency from citizens to actually want to participate or feel that they are able to participate in policy making and to give their input. And that is something that we need to address because we see this episodic participation normally only when it's too late, and then with dissatisfaction and a feeling that policymakers are too far removed, which probably sometimes they are, because there is not the connection to the citizens. There are connections to other technocratic institutions and companies, but the citizens' voice is just not used. But there is space for it, so it's not necessarily the system, but definitely something that we need to boost.
Thank you. I would like to read a question from Wim Huntjens from DGRTD that I think is also connected to this, and again, whoever who would like to comment. He writes, I wonder if we need to add dialogue to the principles. There might be limits to active participation, and dialogue might complement. For example, public broadcasting has played a positive role to bring people along in complex issues and help them shape their view, or to acknowledge that there are different perspectives. And to me personally, this is a very dear topic and theme, right? We were asked how to make it sexy and fun, and I might sound old now, but does it have to be sexy and fun, like it was already asked? Can it not just be dignified and meaningful and nice and important? That could be an alternative, perhaps. So I don't know anybody who would like to reflect on the value of dialogue as a principle of governance.
To me, this is included in participation. You know, if you do participation properly, that will automatically generate dialogue. You know, engagement, you know, we also find, you know, this kind of words, you know, used for this, you know, it's engagement. So to me, this is all subsumed, you know, into the same principle, let's say. And dialogue is just one way that this participation happens.
Thank you. Let us see. Yeah, Ruth.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with Laurent entirely. And I would just say that I want to pull some of the comments from the last question forward, where I think, you know, you have the principle of participation of dialogue. And what that then means is you have to create the spaces, the modalities for that to happen well. And so back to the conversation about private sector interests. Yeah. And private sector interests, as it's been noted, that's not inherently a weakness of democracy, but it becomes so when we don't create the spaces and the supports for others to participate. So as an example, I've been part of many, many different United Nations processes where there has been a lot of tension around the space that private sector companies get versus those that are held by Indigenous communities or other communities, local communities. And that doesn't happen just in and of itself. You know, companies are often well-heeled, have lots of budget, have lots of capacity, human resource capacity to participate in these processes. And obviously, you know, often Indigenous communities, as an example, do not have the same supports. And so what the principle around participation and dialogue inherently implies is that we have to, like, actively, deliberately create a level playing field for that participation and for that dialogue. I'm sorry, Roger, we don't hear you.
Roger.
You're muted.
Yeah, time is flying, and we are even beginning to forget to unmute the microphone. We have 7 minutes left for questions and answers. We have 3 open questions in the Q&A. All of them go towards the, let's say, the policy realm. Let's try to have all 3 of them, if we can, discussed, and then I will hand back to Lorenzo in 7 minutes for his. He will probably sum up everything we said and more than that. So I think I will begin with the question from Rainer Sachs. I'll read it. One of you mentioned that policymakers shy away from uncertainty. That was surely Laurent, and try to eliminate it by more of the same strategies, more data, models, etc. How could we create an environment that values or even loves uncertainty as an inherent quality of complex systems?
Wow, that's a tall one.
It's a tall order. Liselotte comes to our rescue here.
Oh, I'm not sure about rescue. Pressure. Well, I actually, it made me think about what you were mentioning, Roger, that in some of the surveys or articles that you read regarding the management of of the pandemic that there was actually that citizens were receptive, very open, and actually appreciated the acknowledgement of uncertainty and of not knowing where this was heading. And I think that that coming back to what Claire was mentioning about these dishonest narratives that are just leaving out the majority of facts surrounding the complexity of the situation that we're finding ourselves in terms of the environmental unsustainable nature of our societies, we need to acknowledge the range of issues that we have, the limits to our knowledge, and that we still need to act, although we do not know the consequences of the situation as it is on the long term, but we do know that it's bad, and we do know that there is a high likelihood of tipping points. We do not know the exact consequence of those tipping points either, except that it is bad. And the precautionary principle is enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty if we're talking about the European Union. So just on the basis of that principle, which Ruth was asking, don't we have any principles here? This is the overarching principle in environmental policy for the European Union, is the precautionary principle, and polluter pays. So you know, there are at some point a direction was chosen to lean on precaution, and then it became complex, because of course choices also have impacts, and then we're weighing impacts against impacts, and some impacts, especially if it's economic impacts, we might know based on the policies that we make. So we can say this is going to be the impact of this policy that we are doing for an impact that we don't really know what will be, except that it is probably bad. And this is where the discussion becomes very difficult, because the scales are so large, so immensely different. But one is understandable in terms of jobs and economic profit and real life right now, and the other one is very far removed. And our brains don't work well with that, but our brains can accept that people don't have the answers. And I think that it is crucial that policymakers and experts put more focus on what is known and what is unknown, and that it is the unknown that we have to accept and still act upon it, but saying it openly, not just ignoring the uncertainty, because that will give us very narrow solutions when we do that.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the end. I will give the word to Laurent, and before that, I will also just mention that there is a question from Ronan Noel directed towards you, Laurent, about JRC and the JRC Policy Lab and your work on experimentation, where he writes, as much as EU research attempted to explore participation on solutions, arguably, except the strategic foresight work, those capacities to support Green Deal strategies and new governance fail to support transformations. Why so, in your view? This is, of course, also a big question.
Easy questions.
Yeah, and we have a couple of minutes left, but I'm sure you can sort it out, and I'm afraid we won't be able to resolve all the questions today either.
I'll be very brief. No, I just wanted to make a link between uncertainty and the perception of competence. You know, in the world of the 1970s, you know, as one of the first slides, you know, showed, you know, being competent was seen as, you know, I'm the technical expert, you know, you've got a eutrophied body of water, we can put a treatment plant and de-eutrophy it, you know, you have a technical competence. Okay, and so competence was perceived in that way. You know, in a context of uncertainty, you give the impression that people are not competent because they're not able to solve the problem. Okay, and so I think that what we have to do is work on actually shifting the understanding of what competence is towards a more process level, rather than, you know, having the solution. And you know, we're showing that we know how to deal with the situation rather than just having the answer. That's just the one point I wanted to make. And regarding the policy lab and Foresight, I think that's a much broader discussion we can have, separately after this meeting, with Ronan very happily. But indeed, what we are facing is an issue of literacy and mindset. So I think the problem, the capacity of the policy lab is, this is not a miracle. It's limited by people's willingness to engage in these open processes where you embrace uncertainty, where you consider, how open the future is, which makes sometimes people feel uncomfortable because they are operating in a very normative environment, which is, with a culture which is a bit different from what the policy lab does. So here, that's a much broader discussion that we can have further than here.
Thank you very much. And Ruth, you will get the very last word of the panel debate in this webinar.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make the connection between uncertainty and learning in terms of the question on how you actually create the conditions to work with uncertainty. And I think the learning piece is so critical, and we often say experimentation and learning, and it sort of rolls off the tongue. And yet I feel like there's a real lack of emphasis on the learning part, which is such an important part of experimentation and such an important part of kind of working in systems and in complexity. And if you take COVID as an example, again, I'm not sure of the European context entirely, but that was a massive experiment in terms of how to deal with a global pandemic. And we did a whole lot of things well, and we did a whole lot of things probably not so well. And I know in Canada, there's little to no debate on what we learned from that. And this may actually be worldwide. It's sort of like we all just wanted to put it aside and say, that's done now, let's move on. And I understand as human beings, that reflex. However, we have to kind of go back into that and say, what did we learn from that highly uncertain, complex situation? So anyway, I would really like to elevate the importance of learning within this whole conversation and encourage all of our policymakers and governors to really embed that into processes, to do that kind of reflection so that we can work the muscle to understand, therefore, what that means for situations that continue to come towards us that have sort of the same traits.
Thank you very much. And I think that was a very appropriate last word of the panel debate. I see that there are still questions about the issue of the sexiness. And there, I think I would be so bold to recommend the audience just to read our extremely sexy report, because we really did our very best to make the exposition attractive. Lorenzo, it's 2:57 and it's time for the concluding remarks. So if you would be so kind to switch on your camera, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Roger. I'd be very happy. Apparently, such blockage, I cannot share my screen at the moment, and the camera at the moment. That doesn't matter. Okay, that's something unlocked. Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much to everyone, the presenters, the panelists, the moderator. I think it's been incredibly rich conversation, and I would not attempt to summarize all of it because it goes beyond what I can physically do in 2 minutes. But let me just share my feeling of deep appreciation for the fact that there's some resonance about the things that we're saying in this report, and it's very nice to see that there's resonance and appreciation of the nature of the challenges and the nature of the most fundamental endeavor in moving towards sustainability, which really requires us to look deep into our practices, our principles, and the way we move forward, being as individual citizens or in the EU institutions or beyond that. And this sense of comfort is also really a good boost for the work which we have been doing, because I would say that a few years ago it would have been more difficult to push forward some of these ideas, I believe. And the unfortunate situations we're living through, a number of crises and shocks, had positive side effects among the many negative ones, of possibly helping us and realizing that there's something fundamentally wrong in the way we're interpreting and navigating the current times. And I think this is a source of motivation in a way for this trend of work to continue the EEA, and very much to inform the knowledge that we're pulling together for the publication of the next statement output of the European Environment Report, which is due in September 2025. So we'll try to build on your very many insights, especially around democracy, the process and the outcomes together, the principles, the actionability, and the practical entry points that these reports put to the fore, as shared by many of the panelists. And yeah, we're fundamentally, I think, glad to having had this conversation. We look forward to further interactions with panelists and people in the audience, because I also share some of the suggestions, recommendation on about making these concepts and ideas practical. They are practical, but they need to be practiced in order to see change. And we're looking forward to further opportunities for applying these principles and these theories into some context and reflect together with those who have the possibility to govern in those systems. Yeah, I think I will stop here. Again, thank you very much for the questions as well raised to the panelists, because I think it was very pertinent and help us in moving forward. And yeah, I hope you will hear more from us soon on coming initiatives as well. Thank you again.